Observe the accommodation of the most common artificer in a civilized and thriving community, and you will perceive that the number of people of whose industry a part, though but a small part, has been employed in procuring him this accommodation exceeds all computation. The woolen coat, for example, which covers the day laborer, is the produce of the joint labor of a great multitude of workmen. The shepherd, the sorter of wool, the wool comber or carder, the spinner, the weaver, the fuller, the dresser, with many others, must all join their different arts in order to complete even the homely production. How many merchants and carriers, besides, must have been employed in transporting the materials from some of these workmen to others who often live in a very distant part of the country? How much commerce and navigation in particular, how many shipbuilders, sailors, rope makers must have been employed in order to bring together the different drugs made use of by the dyer, which often come from the remotest corners of the world. What a variety of labor, too, is necessary to produce the tools of the meanest of these workmen. It is the great multiplication of the production of all the different arts in consequence of the division of labor which occasions in a well-governed society that universal opulence which extends itself to the lowest ranks of the people.
The words you have just heard are from The Wealth of Nations, written by Adam Smith, published in 1776 and considered to be one of the most important books ever written. Adam Smith was sharply critical of the prevailing economic thinking and practice of his day, an untidy collection of ideas and actions that he called the mercantile system. The mercantilists tended to identify the wealth of a nation with the size of its gold hoard and with the prosperity of a privileged merchant class. Smith insisted that the wealth of a nation consisted not of gold, but of real goods and services, for the use not of the few, but of the whole of the people. The mercantilists proposed to bring greater wealth to the nation by government control of all aspects of trade, domestic and foreign. Smith proposed to bring greater wealth to the nation by largely freeing the individual of such controls. That is, by what he called the system of natural liberty. Under such a system, Smith argued, the individual would be free to participate in those two great wealth-promoting activities, the division of labor and the accumulation of stock, or capital, as we would call it today.
When a man possesses stock sufficient to maintain him for months or years, he naturally endeavors to derive a revenue from the greater part of it, reserving only so much for his immediate consumption as may maintain him till this revenue begins to come in. That part which he expects to afford him this revenue is called his capital. The person who employs his stock in maintaining labor necessarily wishes to employ it in such a manner as to produce as great a quantity of work as possible. He endeavors, therefore, both to make among his workmen the most proper distribution of employment and to furnish them with the best machines which he can either invent or afford to purchase.
But to Smith, all this activity was not an end in itself.
Consumption is the sole end and purpose of all production, and the interest of the producer ought to be attended to only so far as it may be necessary for promoting that of the consumer.
In serving the interests of consumers, should the activities of individuals be permitted free and peaceful expression, or should they be restrained and guided by the visible hand of the ruler, whether king or parliament? This was the central issue in economic policy in 1776, and continues to be so today. Who was this man who still speaks to us across 2 centuries? Adam Smith was born here in Kirkcaldy, on the east coast of Scotland, on June 5th, 1723. Then the town had only about 1,500 inhabitants. Today it has 50,000. Smith's house no longer stands, but a plaque commemorates the spot. Some of his garden remains. In his day, it reached all the way down to the beach. Smith's father died a few months before he was born. The upbringing of the boy fell to his mother, the daughter of a Scottish laird called Douglas. Here at Strathendry Castle, her family seat, young Smith passed his vacations. At 14 years of age, he entered Glasgow University, renowned for the excellence of its teaching. He studied moral philosophy under the celebrated Francis Hutcheson, who imbued him with a love of liberty, reason, and freedom of speech. 3 years later, in 1740, Smith went up to Oxford University, to Balliol College. His next 6 years of study were not without a great element of frustration. The love of learning had degenerated at Oxford. Its teaching was indifferent compared to Glasgow. In Glasgow, teachers were paid according to their effort. In Oxford, they were not.
It will be his own fault if anyone should endanger his health at Oxford by excessive study. Our only business here being to go to prayers twice a day and lectures twice a week. The discipline of colleges and universities is in general contrived not for the benefit of the student, but for the interest, or more properly speaking, for the ease of the master, whether he neglects or performs his duty to oblige the students in all cases to behave to him as if he performed it with the greatest diligence and ability.
Smith reacted by spending most of his time in the college library, educating himself. Having taken his degree, Smith was glad to return to Kirkcaldy, where he continued to study at home, interspersed with long meditative walks by the sea. However, his originality and talent were soon recognized, and he was appointed the professor of logic in Glasgow University. 1 year later, he moved to the chair of moral philosophy. In the mid-18th century, Glasgow was a prosperous city of some 25,000 people. Glasgow thrived because of its near monopoly of tobacco imports from the colonies in America. In his strolls about town, Smith took a sharp interest in its general prosperity. He was a keen observer of business and businessmen. The rich tobacco lord and shipowner John Glassford was one of his closest friends. But Smith was no apologist for the merchant class. Indeed, Smith was one of its strongest critics. He was acutely aware of the preoccupation of these men with gaining monopoly favors from government.
The proposal of any new law or regulation of commerce which comes from this order ought always to be listened to with great precaution, and ought never to be adopted till after having been long and carefully examined, not only with the most scrupulous, but with the most suspicious attention. It comes from an order of men whose interest is never exactly the same with that of the public. The single advantage which a monopoly procures to a single order of men is in many different ways hurtful to the general interests of the country.
In Scottish universities of that time, the teaching of political economy was linked with moral philosophy. The work that first made Adam Smith famous was in ethics, not economics, the theory of moral sentiments. Here he argued that man was motivated not only by self-interest, but also by what might seem the very opposite, a feeling for others, which Smith broadly defined as sympathy.
How selfish soever a man may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortunes of others, and render their happiness necessary to him, though he derives nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it.
Smith's psychology views man as an interplay of two complex and complementary tendencies, self-seeking and fellow-feeling. The book grew out of his university lectures and was extremely well received. One of his students, James Boswell, said,
"Mr. Smith's sentiments are striking, profound, and beautiful. His private character is really amiable. He has nothing of that stiffness and pedantry which is too often found in professors."
1763. Smith was now 40 when he was engaged by the Right Honorable Charles Townshend, who greatly admired the theory of moral sentiments, as tutor to his stepson, Henry, 3rd Duke of Buccleuch. They were to spend 3 years on a grand tour of Europe. Smith would receive £300 a year and expenses, In addition, he would receive $300 a year for life. Smith profited in other ways by this grand tour, in particular through his contacts with the French economists. The young Duke and Smith eventually came to rest in Toulouse for a whole year and a half. Here, Smith became increasingly restive.
The life I led in Glasgow was a pleasurable and dissipated life compared to that which I lead here at present. I've begun to write a book in order to pass away the time.
That book was to be The Wealth of Nations. It had been gestating for 13 years. When the tour was over, Smith returned to Kirkcaldy to give his entire attention to what was to be his great work.
My business here is study. My amusements are long, solitary walks by the seaside. I feel myself, however, extremely happy, comfortable, and contented. I never was, perhaps, more so in all my life.
But 12 more years were to pass before the book would be ready for the printer. During these laborious years, Smith did not neglect his wide circle of friends. He saw much of David Hume. He corresponded with Benjamin Franklin. Smith knew Dr. Johnson's circle, Boswell, who had been his pupil, Garrick the actor, Goldsmith the playwright, the statesman Edmund Burke, the painter Sir Joshua Reynolds, and Robert Adam the architect. His friends constantly urged him to finish his book. Finally, on March 9th, 1776, it was out, and was quickly acclaimed in Britain and in the rest of Europe. In America, The Wealth of Nations was closely studied by political leaders like John Adams, first vice president and second president. The ideas mulled over for a quarter of a century were now crystallized. The sentences beginning The Wealth of Nations give a superb account of the consequences due to the specialization of production.
The greatest improvement in the productive powers of labor and the greater part of the skill, dexterity, and judgment with which it is anywhere directed or applied seem to have been the effects of the division of labor. The effects of the division of labor in the general business of society will be more easily understood by considering in what manner it operates in some particular manufactures. To take an example from a very trifling manufacture, the trade of the pin maker. In the way in which this business is now carried on, not only the whole work is a peculiar trade, but it is divided into a number of branches of which the greater part are likewise peculiar trades. One man draws out the wire, another straightens it, a third cuts it, a fourth points it, a fifth grinds it at the top for receiving the head. To put it on is a peculiar business. To whiten the pins is another. And the important business of making a pin is in this manner divided into about 18 distinct operations. This division of labor is not originally the effect of any human wisdom which foresees and intends that general opulence to which it gives occasion. It is the necessary, though very slow and gradual consequence of a certain propensity in human nature which has in view no such utility. The propensity to truck, barter, and exchange one thing for another.
3 pounds, sorry. Loading that on VAT.
Man has almost constant occasion for the help of his brethren, and it is in vain for him to expect it from their benevolence only. He will be more likely to prevail if he can interest their self-love in his favor and show them that it is for their own advantage to do for him what he requires of them. Whoever offers to another a bargain of any kind proposes to do this. Give me that which I want, and you shall have this which you want, is the meaning of every such offer.
About 40 pence a pound. I've seen them a little bit dearer. Yeah, you can fry some. You can roast this stuff a bit.
It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from regard to their own interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love, and never talk to them of our necessities, but of their advantages.
It's an ounce short of £5, £1.45, all right? Can anybody make...
Every individual is continually exerting himself to find out the most advantageous employment for whatever capital he can command. It is to his own advantage, indeed, and not that of society which he has in view. And he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. By pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of the society, more effectually than when he really intends to promote it. I've never known much good done by those who affected to trade in the public interest.
A piece like that would be 112.
Smith is arguing that in the system of natural liberty, the self-interest of each individual, working through the division of labor and the accumulation of capital, is harnessed in the interests of the whole of society. He goes on to argue that the free market is, in fact, an ingenious mechanism which regulates itself through the interaction of supply and demand.
When the price of any commodity is neither more nor less than what is sufficient to pay the rent of the land, and the wages of labor, and the profits of the stock employed in raising, preparing, and bringing to market according to their natural rates, the commodity is then sold for what may be called its natural price, or what it really costs the person who brings it to market.
Was it? Well, no trouble. We'll sell them easy enough. These plums are terrific value now compared to other fruit. Now, you generally shift a few of those. There's Gaviottas as well. They're a bit cheaper. £2 for 5s, £2.10 for 6s. All in lovely travelling hard condition.
They are. Some Marlow potatoes. Pots. Very, very short. Selling fast.
The actual price at which any commodity is commonly sold is called its market price. It may be above or below or exactly the same with its natural price. When the quantity of any commodity which is brought to the market falls short of the effectual demand, competition will immediately begin, and the market price will rise more or less above the natural price. When the quantity of any commodity which is brought to the market exceeds the effectual demand, the market price will sink more or less below the natural price.
Yeah, 5.20, 150, 163. Yeah, and they're green. They're fresh in and green, they will suit you.
The natural price, therefore, is, as it were, the central price, to which the price of all commodities are continually gravitating. The price of monopoly is upon every occasion the highest which can be got. The natural price, or the price of free competition, on the contrary, is the lowest which can be taken.
Smith saw monopoly as primarily the outcome of access to government favors by special interests, such as the exclusive privileges granted to medieval guilds.
The pretense that guilds are necessary for the better government of trade is without foundation. If you would have your work tolerably executed, it must be done in the suburbs, and you then must smuggle it into town as best you can.
Another prime example was the British colonial system, which was operated essentially for the interests of particular British merchants.
The shopkeepers of England petitioned the Parliament that the cultivators of America might, for the future, be confined to their shop. First, for buying all the goods they wanted from Europe, and secondly, for selling all such parts of their own produce as those trades find it convenient to buy. Great Britain imposes an absolute prohibition upon the erection of steel furnaces in any of her American plantations. She will not suffer her colonists to work in those refined manufactories, even for their own consumption, but insists upon their purchasing of her merchants and manufacturers all goods of this kind. To prohibit a great people from making all that they can of every part of their own produce, or from employing their stock and industry in a way that they judge most advantageous to themselves, is a manifest violation of the most sacred rights of mankind.
Smith's support of the colonial position was a reflection of his general commitment to liberty.
All systems of preference or restraint, therefore, being thus completely taken away, the obvious and simple system of natural liberty establishes itself of its own accord. Every man, so long as he does not violate the laws of justice, is left perfectly free to pursue his interests in his own way, and to bring both his industry and capital into competition with those of any other men or order of men.
What then was the role of government in Smith's philosophy?
According to the system of natural liberty, the sovereign or state has only 3 duties to attend to, plain and intelligible to common understandings. First, the duty of protecting the society from violence and invasion of other independent societies. Secondly, the duty of protecting every member of the society from the injustice or oppression of every other member of it. Thirdly, the duty of erecting and maintaining certain public works and institutions, which it can never be for the interest of any individual or small number of individuals to erect and maintain, because the profit could never repay the expense to any individual or small number of individuals. Yet it does not seem necessary that the expense of those public works should be defrayed from that public revenue, as it is commonly called. A highway, a bridge, a navigable canal may in most cases be both made and maintained by a small toll upon the carriages which make use of them.
So Adam Smith prescribed minimum functions to government, but he warned of the dangers of overextended government.
Great nations are never impoverished by private, though they sometimes are by public prodigality and misconduct. It is the highest impertinence of presumption, therefore, in kings and ministers to pretend to watch over the economy of private people. For kings and ministers are themselves always and without exception the greatest spendthrifts in the society. Let them look well after their own expense, and they may safely trust private people with theirs. If their own extravagance does not ruin the state, that of their subjects never will.
But despite the wastefulness of governments, Smith argued that
the uniform, constant, and uninterrupted effort of every man to better his condition, the principle from which public and national as well as private opulence is originally derived, is frequently powerful enough to maintain the natural progress of things towards improvement, in spite both of the extravagance of government and of the greatest errors of administration. Like the unknown principle of animal life, it frequently restores health and vigor to the constitution, in spite not only of the disease, but of the absurd prescriptions of the doctor.
Smith's call then was for limited government, but even this required a source of revenue.
The subjects of every state ought to contribute towards the support of government as nearly as possible in proportion to their respective abilities. That is, in proportion to the revenue which they respectively enjoy under the protection of the state.
The taxation policy of the British government was deeply involved in the reaction of the American colonies.
The Parliament of Great Britain insists upon taxing the colonies, and they refuse to be taxed by a parliament in which they are not represented. If to each colony which should detach itself from the General Confederacy, Great Britain should allow such a number of representatives as suited the proportion of what it contributed to the public revenue of the empire, a new method of acquiring importance, a new and more dazzling object of ambition would be presented to the leading men of each colony. Unless this or some other method is fallen upon of preserving the importance and gratifying the ambition of the leading men of America, it is not very probable that they will ever voluntarily submit to us. And we ought to consider that the blood which must be shed in forcing them to do so is, every drop of it, blood either of those who are or whom we wish to have as our fellow citizens. They are very weak who flatter themselves that in the state to which things have come, our colonies will be easily conquered by force alone. The persons who now govern the resolutions of what they call their Continental Congress feel in themselves at this moment a degree of importance which perhaps the greatest subjects in Europe scarce feel. From shopkeepers, tradesmen, and attorneys, they are become statesmen and legislators, and are employed in contriving a new form of government for an extensive empire which, they flatter themselves, will become, and which indeed seems very likely to become, one of the greatest and most formidable that ever was in the world. The rulers of Great Britain have amused the people with the imagination that they possessed a great empire on the west side of the Atlantic. And this empire, however, has existed in the imagination only. If the project cannot be completed, it ought to be given up. If any of the provinces of the British Empire cannot be made to contribute towards the support of the whole empire, it is surely time that Great Britain should free herself from the expense of defending those provinces in time of war and of supporting any part of their civil or military establishments in time of peace, and endeavour to accommodate her future views and designs to the real mediocrity of her circumstances.
Adam Smith ended his days in Edinburgh, in this house. In the summer of 1790, his health declined, and one Sunday evening he found that he could not sit up with his old friends as usual. Retiring to bed, he took leave of them with these words:
I believe we must adjourn this meeting, gentlemen, to some other place.
A few days later, on July 17th, he died. Adam Smith's real memorial is in his books. The great questions that he wrote about in 1776 are equally relevant and equally troubling to the world of today.
The man of system seems to imagine that he can arrange the different members of a great society with as much ease as a hand arranges the different pieces upon a chessboard. He does not consider that the pieces have no other principle of motion besides that which the hand impresses upon them. But in the great chessboard of human society, every single piece has a principle of motion of its own, altogether different from that which the legislator might choose to impress upon it. The natural effort of every individual to better his own condition, when suffered to exert itself with freedom and security, is so powerful a principle that it is alone and without any assistance not only capable of carrying on the society to wealth and prosperity, but of surmounting 100 impertinent obstructions which the folly of human laws too often encumbers its operations.